Welcome to the webinar today. My name is Bill Baker, and it's getting to be close to back to school time if you haven't already started your schools. Time to get ready for the oncoming class. Thanks you for joining us. Our webinar today is co-sponsored by the RenWeb organization. This is part of the Crisis Coach webinar series. Our subject is violence prevention, identifying behaviors of concern. Our presenter today is Jim Satterfield, who is the president of Firestorm. We'd also like to invite you to become our friend on Facebook. Having a problem there, Mr. Satterfield?
Okay. Hang.
Need to plug in your little computer.
Bill, I'm having a battery issue here, so let me just make sure that everything gets plugged back in, and we'll get this rolling again.
Okay.
And I think you're good to go now. Good.
Good.
Next slide.
There you go. Problems are always fun. You can become our friend at Facebook, Firestorm Solutions, and you can follow us on Twitter at Firestorm Soul. There is a hashtag. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. We do want to remind you the presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion, and this work product should be read and considered in conjunction with advice from your organization's personal counsel. This information should not be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. RenWeb has been sponsoring us and underwriting these webinars for several years now. You can go to firestorm.com, watch past webinars, and you can register for future webinars in the series. This is the 8th in the 2016 Crisis Coach webinar, and we're pleased to have Jim Satterfield as our presenter. Scott Smith is not able to join us today. He's out with customers, and we'll turn things over to you, Jim, if you want to say some nice things about RenWeb.
I'd always like to say nice things about RenWeb and nice things even about Scott. Hopefully many of you were at the user conference last month down in Miami. We were fortunate enough to be there, and excellent turnout and great content. And if you've never attended one of the user group meetings, I would encourage you to do so. And the webinar series, as Bill pointed out, is recorded and available for replay and share within your school. By the way, the schools here in Georgia started right around August the 1st, and I can remember when I was a child, if we'd started that early, I would have been very upset. So I know that you're all working and getting everything set to run if you're not already engaged in classes as we speak. So I think the question comes up, what keeps you up at night? Are you worried? And we've got back to school, and we see lots of things going on out there. And unfortunately, when we look on the television and we look at media, we see lots of issues around active shooters. In fact, that seems to dominate. We've had the shootings in Orlando, and we've had shootings around the country, and we always are reminded of events that happen at schools. And the first was a survey that we had done, and you saw that there's a very large percentage of organizations out there, schools and businesses, focused on and concerned about the topic. But if you look at the one on the right, that survey is very telling in that half of them don't have a program focused on behaviors of concern. And that's the concept that we're going to talk about today, are behaviors of concern, not just active shooter. Because when you think about an active shooter plan, that's saying, okay, the person's standing there with a gun, what do I do now? What we want you to do is to try to identify those behaviors of concern before the gun comes to school. And that's going to be our emphasis in our conversation today, and to give you some insights on what you can put in place and move that needle down the road. In fact, there's an opportunity via RenWeb that would allow you to have a program that addresses that, and at the first year, there is no cost. So we'll even mention that before we finish today. So when we think about it, the question comes up, can we prevent violence? And whether you're calling it terrorism or workplace violence or whatever term, the answer is there are always going to be warning signs. There are going to be things that you can look at and see this is a path to violence. And that's what we really want to zero in on our discussion today. Because if you have those programs in place, it's easier to deal with a behavior of concern. It's simpler. There's going to be less impact on our students and our staff and our parents if we can intervene early in this process. Now, when you look at this picture, you're going, and I say, okay, which person, which dot there is on a path to violence? And you look at that and say, they look similar. I can't tell you which one is bad. But suddenly you think about it and you start to see, wait a minute, that red dot, that's different than everybody else. There's a behavior there that makes them stand out, and I can recognize and identify that. That's what we're going to be talking about today, is how you can figure out how that dot is red. Remember, you're going to be looking at it as it is now. You're not going to see that sticking out if you don't put a program in place, and what's even worse, others may be seeing it and they're not telling you about it. So once it becomes apparent, once we can see it there, we must then intervene with that student, with that teacher, or whoever is exhibiting those behaviors of concern before it starts to escalate and turns into a violence event that overtakes everything around it. Because that's when we talk about active shooter. Do you want to deal with it before you started to see it expand and grow into this big dominating feature? The answer is yes, because it means so much more to us in our school and make a difference. So what's been happening historically? Well, every time after there's something bad that's happened, media talks to people and people go, well, you know, I knew something was going to happen. There just wasn't something right about that person, but they didn't come forward. And that's the difference, that we have to instill an environment that knowledge comes to you so that you can help the students in your school at this point in time. So the challenge, I think, for all of us is to focus on what if we could stop an act of violence? What if you could stop cutting or bullying, or someone that's contemplating suicide, or someone that's even rising to the point that they feel that violence is the only answer? That's where we want to focus our attention. And we can show you how that can be done within your school. Now, I want to take you a little bit away, and then we'll bring you back to this concept. And we're going to start to tell a story. And we're going to talk about Fred. And Fred works in a school, or he works in a business, and he has had a poor performance review. And by the way, we're going to call him Fred Rogers, like Mr. Rogers from Welcome to My Room at this point, to share the story. So there's a point of reference. There's a dot. Now, let's see if those dots continue. Wait a minute, there's an argument. So there's another piece of information that we would pick up. And a coworker reported that he was upset and said, you guys are going to be sorry. Again, another dot starts to appear. And then finally, Fred starts not coming to work on such a regular basis, and is late, and his changes are there, and he's talking crazy, according to Fred's friends. And finally, he posts that he's tired of being treated like a dog and is going to make them sorry. Well, those are data points, but it's kind of hard to connect them. But if we started looking at what do his friends say, what do his coworkers say, what does his supervisor observe, then we can know more. So who's in charge? We all are responsible. Can they see it? Sometimes we're the last person to know, and so if this information is siloed, if it's kept in disparate systems, then you're not going to see it. So we've got to get all this information together into one central repository so that you can see the pattern as it starts to develop. So let's talk about how it develops. Oops, there's some more observations that are starting to fit in. Still not making much sense to me, but we'll start to connect the dots. And we continue to connect the dots, and we start to see what emerges, and what emerges is a picture of a gun. And if you don't collect all that information, keep it in a single point, and connect all these dots and have a system to do it, the behaviors of concern that were represented in the 6 boxes won't come together to represent the gun that's outlined in red in front of you. That's what's going on with Fred. He's on a path to violence, and we need to intercede. So now that's the theory behind what we're going to be talking about today, and sharing details about what you can do so that you can connect the dots before you have to see the gun. So who's going to commit violence in a workplace? In a school as a workplace. We see domestic violence coming into the workplace regularly and into our schools. We see that happening with our students when they go home. It could be employees, strangers. All of those elements are coming together. The second leading cause of death of women in the workplace is, in fact, workplace violence. And so when we think about that, that's a challenge for all of us to address and respond to. So how do we reduce this risk of workplace violence? Well, we developed a program to deal with that and create a culture where everyone's treated with dignity and respect. Hang on one second, I've got to ignore that, and I will. And if you've got that kind of an environment, that our students are important and who we are important, that comes forward, and you need a program that's identifying with workplace violence prevention. Now, you'll notice that I didn't list an active shooter program, because an active shooter program is focused on one thing only, and you're concerned about these behaviors of concern that cover broader things that can have an impact on our young people. So we've got to train everyone on what are the warning signs and the behaviors that should be reported, understand how we would do a risk assessment, how will we be able to see, is this threat real and actionable? And we always are going to be concerned about physical security. As you all know, the standards and best practices are that our classrooms should lock from the inside. We're trying to keep a barrier between the classroom and an active shooter in that environment. The cameras in your school, fences, door locks, all of those elements come together. But what we're going to be focusing on today is in particular the behaviors of concern and what we can put in place to make that difference. Additionally, we're going to need an intelligence network. We're going to have to monitor, and we'll share some insights learned around what that needs to be done. And of course, we're going to need response protocols, lockdown, lockout, shelter in place, evacuate. All of those steps come together to build a comprehensive program. So there are a lot of lessons learned when we think about this concept of violence, and particularly workplace violence and violence in our schools today. So what have we learned from those? There are always warning signs. Let me say that one again. There are always warning signs. You need to be able to address those issues and see what they are before they rise to the element of violence. Now, this second bullet here is very important. 80% of the time, if someone has ill intent, someone else knows. And 67% of the time, 2 or more people know. And so there's knowledge in your school about events that were happening, and it gives you an opportunity to intervene. By the way, the story that comes back that points many people in this direction is from a shooting that happened in the 1990s in Alaska. And there was a young man who told his friends that he was going to shoot people in the cafeteria, and there was a little mezzanine level up above. And he told some people, and he went up there to be ready to shoot. He was joined by approximately 30 other students who watched him shoot. No one had come forward. We fast forward this to a year and a half ago. Karen Mazzullo, who's our EVP and Chief Intelligence Officer, was monitoring social media, and saw a picture of a student in a classroom holding a gun. And it bothered her, and she did research and figured out that it was a math class, who the teacher's name was able to trace it back to a school in Myrtle Beach, contacted the principal of the school and said, I don't know if it's a real picture or a made-up one, but it bothered me and we thought you'd want to know. He went and checked, and yes, the student had a gun in the classroom and was able to intervene and handled the discipline on that. But the thing that bothered him were 35 other students in his school had posted on social media about the gun in the classroom. Not one of them had come forward. That's why we're talking about creating a culture, getting that communications where you need today. So what we need to do is to look at this and see it's the grudges, it's those elements that need to come forward, but we've got to create an environment where this anonymous reporting starts to come forward. Now, people just don't snap. You don't have a kid that's great today and tomorrow bang. It's accumulation of these things, and you'll see a pattern of these warning signs and signals and cues coming. But the individual one may not be critical at that point, but it's the accumulation of them that's going to cause and make a difference for you to act. Now, there is a difference between behaviors of concerns and threats. And, you know, I can spot the red apple on the screen. It's amazing how I was able to do that. Aren't you impressed? Because the threat stands out. And so what we need to do is to take threats and treat them differently than anything else. And so if we're thinking about a threat versus a behavior of concern, that should be a higher priority and should immediately have us focusing on that individual of what we can do and intervene before that threat becomes acted on and becomes a violent act in our school. So threatening behavior is clear. It's bullying, it's cyberbullying, it's fights, it's stalking, it's date violence. Lots of studies around that. Sexting, as we've seen in those areas. Threats are verbal or physical associated with it, and weapons at school. And obviously in most of our schools, any weapons on the school ground would lead to either expulsion or suspension or termination. But when you see the threatening behavior, it's very clear, and that's an immediate call to action. But the people that are seeing that threat have to let you know, and you have to keep that information in a central location so that you can see the pattern. We're going to talk about changes in a few minutes, but start to plant the seed in your mind. It's the change in behavior that becomes the key indicator to you in the process. Some of these red flags on behavior of concern are extremely clear. You should take any suicide threat as real. And what we find with our students is if there's a suicide threat, there's also a kill list. Here are the people that I'm going to even the score with before I take my own life. And I know you all know that we don't treat this as a joke. We're going to intervene immediately. If there's talks about getting a weapon, hurting other people, destroying property, fits of rage, you can read down the list of the types of things that you see would come up. Those are clear. Some aren't so clear. The fascination with weapons, depression, any substance abuse that could well be a beginning of a behavior of concern that we, of course, want to address in our school. Abuse at home. We're seeing the domestic violence coming in and being a factor in work. And look at the middle one there where it says major changes in behavior. The sitting alone at lunch, not being involved in the clubs or the sports teams, not performing as they had done. Look for change as a key behavior of concern indicator. Inflexible, anything that makes you think, I should be worried about this student or this child. So who poses the highest threat and the highest risk here? It's one with multiple losses, a family going through divorce and financial trouble, someone with health issues, suicidal thoughts. The more specific the threat, the more targeted it would be. I'm going to bring a gun tomorrow to school and settle this once and for all. If they're the constant butt of the jokes and being laughed at, intoxication, abruptly pulling out of, you know, I'm concerned about this, and then dropping something that they were very passionate about. That change represents an indicator at this point that we would look at. So as we think about it, are there positive things? Yep, there's some protective things, things that would reduce the potential of this individual acting out at this point in time and creating the problem. It's, do they have friends? How interactive are they? It's that child that is isolated from the rest of the students, that child that's not participating and working as a part of the team in the school. Don't have the interest outside, respects authority, coping skills, takes responsibility. If you have those areas, it lowers the probability that that behavior of concern will escalate to violence. So what does? 3 things: breakdown of support systems, workplace factors, what's going on in school, and personal factors. If you put it into those 3 categories, it may well help you better to understand it. Now, it gets complex when you bring all of these factors together at the same point in time. This behavioral snapshot is a way that we look at what's going on. You'll notice that we look at psychological, social, threat-related, workplace, family, and then the person's in the middle. And around it, they have protective factors that we just were talking about. So regularly, we will go in, and your threat management team or behavioral management team in the school can start to see how many of those factors are there, and then that starts to give us an indication: are we on a path to violence? Is this escalating, or is it de-escalating, or is it stable? And then the mitigating factors there with the protective ones become very important. Now, I'm emphasizing that this is a snapshot as opposed to a movie. Whatever behavior you're seeing today, you're seeing it in isolation. You need to view it in context. What's happening over time? Is this behavior escalating, or is it de-escalating? Those are the issues that I think we need to look at. Another way to think about that is, see the red ball in the center of the screen? Is that ball going up or down? If I took it and threw it down and took a picture, you wouldn't be able to tell from the picture if it was moving up or down. That's why you need to do the behavioral screening and include the observations over time to have a good interpretation, to saying, is this escalating or is it not escalating? So if you wanted to put together a program to deal with behavioral risk and threat assessment, where do you start? Well, start with awareness training. You've got to make sure that everybody knows what to look for. We've talked today very quickly about warning signs and signals and indicators, but that needs to be something that everyone understands. And there has to be an environment to get over that seeing something and not telling. Many of our children view telling as tattling, and so they won't come forward and share that information in the way that they need to. This is an opportunity for you to be able to change that culture and create that environment. Now, we will talk about that a little bit more with anonymous reporting as a part of our intelligence network, but you've got to create this culture at the very beginning that that's who we are and where we run our school. So, intelligence network, anonymous reporting, and by the way, most of the failures of anonymous reporting today don't take into account the change of environment that we're in. If you are in an older generation, you're used to picking up the phone and calling. If you're a part of our young campus that we now have with our students, they're used to texting. So if your anonymous reporting doesn't include text reporting, you're not going to get the information that you need to have when you need to have it. Also, social media monitoring. Remember the comment about when someone has ill intent, somebody else knows. And when they know, what do? They talk about it. Where do they talk about it? Social media. The good news is that monitoring is available to you now, and it's not as expensive as it was years ago. So you can find out what's being said about your school, your students, your teachers, and the mood that environment creates. You've got to have a standard reporting method. Background screening, as you all know, any volunteer or teacher has to have an annual background check, and because that's standards and best practices, and that background check must include misdemeanors at the local level. So if you're doing a felony national background check, you're only going to find individuals who were convicted of a felony. But if they were arrested for a felony, but then plea bargained to a misdemeanor, the only way to find that is reviewing the records at your county courthouse. And then establishing key metrics. Key metrics might be things like attendance. A student who used to always be there now has absenteeism. A student whose grades used to be good and now are not. That is an indicator here for us on behaviors of concern. When you think about the intelligence network and monitoring, that's a factor of where our young people live today. That's where they talk. That's where the information is. And you have the ability to listen. That's looking at words and streams and phrases. In addition to looking at an individual, what's their sphere of influence? Who are they talking to? What did they say on Thursday of last week and the Thursday of the week before? Is this escalating? Is it coming together? And we're only looking at information that's in the public domain, but that information is out there and there's an expectation. The story I told you about the student in the math class, the next day a parent called and saw the picture that had been on their child's phone and was telling the principal, and the principal says, we're aware of it, we've already handled it. Imagine the power of that versus being surprised, of not knowing about what was going on. So today we know that someone that would have violence is talking about it, and they're talking on social media. And for a few $100s a month, you can have that understanding and knowledge. Anonymous reporting is an issue, and it's a culture as well as a tool. We use Tip Now. It's a software product that we've been very pleased with, and it gives the ability to have a phone tip. It gives the ability to have a text message coming in and to have it be two-way. The ability to text that message back and forth and communicate with anonymous texting. And that gives you the control to know what's going on to get the response in place today. This is where our world has moved, and you need to move forward. If you want to have voice reporting of that, you can do that with your staff, or we can arrange for a contact center to take those calls, screen them, and that means that we have the chance to intervene, particularly if someone is contemplating suicide or on a path to immediate violence episode. Looking for that makes a difference. As we move beyond that, we think about a central repository. Now, what happens is a teacher sees something, another teacher sees, a coach might observe it, a student might observe it, and all those little silos of information never come together. So all tips, all reports need to be in a central spot so that there's a threat management team or a behavioral management team, if you prefer to call it there, that works to review all of those reports. And so when you've got this data warehouse, and it could be a piece of paper and a file cabinet, it could be digital. The Tip Now people have a central repository that allows the coordination of their tips as well as you putting your own reports in it. It gives you the ability to manage that process all the way through. So you want to gather the reports, take a look at it, and then you can start to see there's a pattern here. There's an increased frequency of these behaviors of concern. There's an increased severity associated with them, and we need to intervene on a much more aggressive base. And the last step is then the behavioral risk threat assessment plan. That's the actual, what do you do with that tip? How do you categorize the risk at this point in time? Now, we do that by categorizing it low, medium, or high. Low, the other word we use is routine. Your normal discipline would handle that tip, that particular concern. So we're not really talking about focusing there. The high is calling 911 because the person is standing there with a gun. So those two outer areas are not where we want to focus. It's that middle ground. So think of the low as routine. Think of the high as urgent, so you're getting outside involvement. It's that middle ground where most schools miss the opportunity to intervene and make a difference in the child's life. And that's where we're going to focus. And in that middle ground, we would then call that an investigation, and we'll talk about how we divide that in a moment. In any event, you've got to take action. You have to monitor and continue to monitor, sign off, and record keeping. And if someone had a problem in the 9th grade, you'd want to follow them in the 10th, the 11th, and the 12th, because those patterns could be traced through it. Now, if you put all of that together, here's how it would look in a map. The gold bar over to the left is the awareness. That's awareness that needs to be done for your students, for your teachers, and your parents. That gives you the ability for that. You've got a lot of eyes looking and a lot of ears listening to what's going on. It's then fed into the intelligence network for the reporting, the creating the monitoring through the social media. You could have a call center or have those calls come into someone else, how they're reported, the background checks, and there are those key metrics that we talked about, grades, attendance, participation. The Bertha plan then talks about the initial categorization, then the threat management team then does the investigation and the screening, and then they would do the monitoring and the case management. What are we going to do with this student now? And then the continual record keeping and following it through. Additionally, looking at your policies and procedures and emergency plans and your physical security within your individual campus. Now, I said I would talk a little bit more about the screening of that middle level. So let's delve into that a little bit more as we're talking about it. So it's not routine, it's not low, and it's not the urgent immediately about to be a shooter on our campus. What about that middle behavior? We're unsure. Well, we divide that into 3 levels: guarded, elevated, and severe. Guarded is that behavior that's just a little bit more than a normal or routine background. Well, we would monitor, we would stay in touch, we would continue observing at this point. You're not going to have an immediate concern of a path to violence going forward. An elevated risk is much more. It's one where we've done our screening, and now we're saying, you know, if we don't intervene, we can't rule out that there'll be a violence point down the road, that there's a potential there for us to take action. In that situation, then we're going to have a conversation, have a case management plan in place. We're going to work with that child and his family or her family to help through that process. If we view it at a severe level, that it's very likely there's going to be violence in the immediate or foreseeable future, then we're going to probably suspend that child, not let them come back to school until a psychiatrist or forensic psychologist signs off and said this person is no longer a risk to themselves or others, and we'll have a reentry plan. What are we going to do with this student to monitor through that process? We worked with a school here in Georgia in the spring where there had been a death threat made by a particular student. Can't ignore that death threat. What was the plan? How would that be dealt with? Could that student ever return to the school? And if so, what are the circumstances under it? Now, we leave one other out in this process, and that is it could even be after you've done your investigation, after your threat management team has gone through the process, that they think it's imminent, and so you can still call 911 here at that point. But generally, we would have caught that in our initial categorization, but that's still another outcome that could come from this behavior of concern screening. Now, some recommendations. You need to take action. The survey that we shared at the very beginning, half of the organizations don't have a program to deal with behaviors of concern. That's an opportunity for you to immediately start to make a difference in your school. At the end of the day, no one wants to pick up a phone and call a family and tell them that their child won't be coming home from school today. That's why we want to put our focus. Look at behaviors of concern. Look at your anonymous reporting program. Make sure that you're getting people trained and aware and how they would do it, and then have a formal threat assessment process, as we've just described to you, and I'll tell you in just a minute about next steps of something you might do there. Training for the threat assessment team, training for everyone that's involved and associated with it. There are now insurance products that you might want to consider too, related around deadly weapons and sexual molestation. And in saying sexual molestation, remember behaviors of concern are also indicated there. That's why this is much more than just an active shooter program. Looking at an intelligence network, the monitoring of social media, pulling all of those things together in a central repository, being able to track it, and then finding support. Support virtually or in your community, so that if you needed to reach out to involve a forensic psychologist or to have additional insight into what the decisions that you're making, now you have that channel represented. So next steps. Start an awareness and prevention training program now in your school. If we're back to school in the fall, everyone should be aware of what to look for, what's changed from last year, what are you concerned about, where are those areas going. Put an intelligence network in place to monitor social media. That'll be an important element to keep you involved, to know what's happening. Develop workplace violence prevention, or if you're more comfortable talking about a school violence prevention, we recognize that that needs to be put into place. You've got to have emergency response protocol. We recommend following the standard response procedures of shelter in place, lockout, lockdown, and evacuate, and train on what to do at that point in time. You should now, and to perform through RenWeb, you have the opportunity that if you found yourself in a crisis at your school, you can contact Firestorm, and we'll do the initial consultation with you that first critical hour, because that's where we see mistakes happening at no cost to you. And that becomes an important element associated with it. Look at your insurance and what's covered under your current insurance policies. Insurance companies could be source of assessments and providing you support and training, as well as coverage that would be available. And make sure your response plans align to standards and best practices, and test your plan. The notes from today, there'll be a brief that's available on the Firestorm website. You can go there and download it. I don't know if it's up yet today, but will be up very shortly. And there'll be copies of the slides and a way to think about it. There is an opportunity then for you to gain that information and have it as a chance to share along with a recording of today's webinar. Now, our thanks go out to RenWeb for underwriting this webinar series and for making this information available. There is a program called Behavioral Risk Threat Assessment. The acronym for that is BRTHA. If you'd like to have that put into your school, RenWeb is underwriting the cost of it for the first year. So you can have a behavioral risk threat assessment program from Firestorm via RenWeb first year at no cost. Money and the safety of children should not be used in the same sentence. So this takes that issue off the table. If you decide you don't like the program and don't want to continue to use it after the first year, there is no penalty. If you do use it in the second year, you would pay a license fee. So there are opportunities out there to address and deal with behaviors of concern. We find ourselves in an environment today that if we don't address those, then we're going to be facing a threat and a risk and have to respond in a critical situation. We would much more want to see you intervene when it's just a behavior of concern before it escalates to an act of violence. You can reach us at firestorm.com. If you go there, you can get the brief that we talked about, view the recording today or other recordings of webinars in the series. If you've got an individual question, drop us an email at webinars@firestorm.com, and we'll be glad to answer it, or pick up the phone at 800-321-2219. There's an opportunity here to get help and get support. We're going to try to reach out to everyone that was on today's call and to answer your questions and to see what help that we can be. Thank you for all that you do every day to help our students, to help them grow physically and morally and intellectually. At this point, it's a key point in their lives. School should be a safe place. School should be a place of support and family and a chance to grow and to prosper. We can make a difference if we intervene when there are behaviors of concern. We don't want that to rise to violence, injury, and even worse, death. There's a chance here to make a difference. And by looking for the warning signs, by intervening early, you won't have to worry about the active shooter. The gun won't come to school. Thank you for joining us today. We'll do another webinar next month. Good luck with back to school. I hope to talk to you soon. Goodbye.